I am Dariella Nieves, and you are Kicking It With Me. Tomeka M. Winborne is a writer-director that passionately loves to create stories that will invoke conversations. As a filmmaker, Tomeka centers many of her stories around social issues. Her most recent short film that is in post-production is entitled We're Left Behind. Tomeka's short film, Aged Out, was screened at the Cine Odyssey Film Festival and the Bronze Lens Film Festival. She has also screened Aged Out as a fundraiser for Becoming Families, a foster care nonprofit. Tomeka also produces and hosts a podcast called Tea Talks with Tomeka. It's a podcast about women filmmakers, their journeys, and their projects. In addition to making movies and podcasts, she's also produced television segments, commercials, written novels, worked as a field reporter, and has been commissioned to produce documentaries. In 2014, she developed Lavender Reel Media Group, a production and media services company producing commercials, documentaries, and other film projects. It's really amazing all the things that I just read in her bio because I am a personal friend of Tomeka's. I've known her for a little bit over 10 years, and she is someone that I can always rely on to, give me information and share information as not just a friend, but also as a business person. And so I'm going to bring her on right now. Welcome to the show, Tomeka.
Hey, Doree, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I can hear your smile.
I was just thinking, as you read everything, and then when you said, we've known each other for 10 years, I was like, gosh, time flies.
Yeah, probably longer. I know when I moved to Virginia, where Tomeka was living, it was about 2004, but I met you a few years later, and you had already written your first book, Where My Strength Comes From. I want to start by talking about your background and your journey into all these creative ventures that you did, because at the time you had already written your first book, but you hadn't done any films yet. And so let's talk a little bit about how you got into filmmaking, writing the book, filmmaking, whatever, you want to focus on, because a lot of people want to do either of those things and not sure how to start or if they have to go to film school or whatever.
Oh, great question, because, that's really true. I'm going to start here and then I'll go backwards. But for a long time, I really didn't think filmmaking was an accessible or tangible goal. I thought I need to go to film school, but I couldn't afford to go to film school. So I was like, I'm not sure if I could do this. I didn't know anyone making films. I didn't have access to people with cameras or making film. And then after, I don't remember, I just one day was like, I'm going to do it. And I bought books and I did not go to film school. And then we'll come back to the filmmaking journey, but I'll go back to my beginnings. Not too long ago, I thought about where did this come from? Because I just didn't, it's sort of weird, but I grew up and my sister and I attended a Catholic private school during elementary years. And so I really recently thought about that was probably the birthing of my creative juices, because I was a really shy child. And when I went to, it was called St. Mary's in Norfolk, Virginia. And so every year we would have these plays and musicals, and we studied in, first, second grade, Maya Angelou, Nicchia Giovanni, so it was introduced to me very early. But again, it still felt very far-fetched. Fast forward years later, when I went through, I was, I guess, about 19 or so, I was going through my journey and, trying to redefine who I was. Let me just say, figure out who I was. So what I did was I used to write poetry, but it wasn't poetry that I would read or recite. It wasn't poetry that I even really shared with other people, other than my close and intimate friends. And so one day I was writing, and I've always been a curious child, and I was very, I cared a lot about injustices as a child. And I think, again, that goes back to the school we went to, because they had us in fifth grade marching with Jesse Jackson when they were busing. So I think, again, I was introduced to understanding what injustice was very early on. And we talked a lot about race, and we talked a lot. And although it was white nuns, but they taught us to love ourselves as Black people. And so um, one day I was watching, and I don't know if you remember, but there were years ago, there was this young man who was in, I think it was Nordstrom's, and they accused him of stealing like a bracelet or a watch or something, and the police shot him. And I just felt devastated. And I felt like at that moment, the poems were not enough. And all of a sudden, I had a vision for this book, Where My Strength Comes From. And God sort of gave me the title, and it wasn't like a Christian book, I would say. We talk, she goes through her healing journey or whatever, but, it was more of a coming of age story. And I remember having the title that came to me, and then also the beginning and the end of the book. And that was the beginning of my journey. And to be honest with you, I was talking to a friend recently. I wrote like one huge big paragraph as a book. And so then when I got an editor, she helped me break it down. So the moral to that story is sometimes we just have to do it, make the mistakes. And I learned so much through working with my editor, Tanya Hill. She's married now, and I cannot think of her last name now. But, I learned a lot because she was very patient. She was like, Tomeka, you have great dialogue. You have a great story, but this is too long. You can't have just one big paragraph. And I'm exaggerating just a bit. But to that point, that was the beginning of my journey.
That's great. And that is important for us to remember, is that we don't have to know everything in order to get started. A lot of people think that we have to have the money for the film school or the business school, or, know how to write grants or know how to apply for this or do this or hire this person or whatever. It's like, just start from where you are. Creativity and life in general is not ever a linear path from point A to point B. It's always ups and downs and hills and valleys. And so, but if you never start, then, who knows, what you could have been. I think that's an important tip. And it's pretty cool. I didn't know that about you going to Catholic school and all that stuff. And I think it's really interesting that they exposed you to those poets like Nikki Giovanni, because, she's not mainstream, she's not for everybody. Some people that are listening might not even know who that is. But she is a fabulous Black woman who is an activist and a poet and just very prolific. And you definitely need to Google her if you don't know who she is. It's Nikki with 2 Ks.
Yes. Totally amazing. And, and I thought, like my friends and I, it was a very small school, but that experience was so rich, so rich. Like we did one of the plays we did was The Boycott with Rosa Parks. And so they would use history in the form of art. So I really feel like it was a great influence on my journey, just differently. I do want to share one other thing real quick, Doree, because
Sure.
As we were talking, one thing I would want to inspire your audience to believe in themselves in whatever it is you have vision for. A lot of times, the fear will cause us not to do it, or the lack of resources. But what I have found on my journey is once you get past a certain point and you're diligent in getting it done, it's always like it will be provided. And I just want to share this, and I've never shared this with anyone publicly, so I'll share it with you. When I was working on Where My Strength Comes From, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I just was an artist, but there was a part of me that felt like, I don't really want to send out query letters. I want to own my content. I don't want it to be influenced. And I'm not against, because I think today I would love to have an agent and publisher that would do the work for me. But I think it was important for me to learn the business of it. So I went to Barnes and Noble, and I had no idea what self-publishing was. And I bought this self-publishing guide, and it told me what to do, starting your LLC, blah, 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 blah. So so I just followed the rules. I had no knowledge of what I was doing. Well, at that time, self-publishing was a little different than it is today. It wasn't where you could buy, sort of like do print on demand. It was more so you buy these books in bulk. So it was about $10,000 for me to purchase or have 2,000 books printed. So, I had been saving money and I used to sell real estate. And, at that time I wasn't, but I saved enough money, but I was short $1,500 for the print company, right? I had a dream that night that I had gotten, that this lady had given me a credit card, but she said, this is a dream. I'm going to give you this card, but when you finish with it, I want you to take the card and give it to somebody else to use when you're done. And back then, when that happened, because that was around 2005, that wasn't when we had, the cards that you could upload your money, that wasn't even in existence yet. And so the next morning when I woke up, I got an email from my credit card saying that my credit card had been increased by $1,500, the exact amount I needed to have my book published, printed.
Wow.
So I say that to say is sometimes like we worry about the last step, but we just need to get it done and then everything will be provided for us.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Everything will be provided.
If it's meant to be, anyways, because some things we do are not meant to be.
That was a great story. I think that sometimes we do have divine intervention, and that is one of the ways that we know that we're on the right path, even though we're not quite sure of the whole thing. I think you may have seen this quote online someplace where it says, that you may not see the whole staircase, but all you have to do is just take the next step,
Yes.
just do the next right thing. And so I am inspired by, even though I know you and I don't like totally fan out, I am inspired when I think about and see, some of your work. You have done several short films, and the latest one that I have seen is called Aged Out. And it talks about, people that are in foster care, that when they get to age 18, they are aged out of the system. And then what happens to them there? There's so many thousands of people in this country in foster care that have, no provisions when they get out. So I want to talk about, because this is Foster Care Awareness Month, May, and I want to talk about not only the film, but also what inspired you to care about foster care specifically.
Thank you, Doree. Like many people, I never thought about youth aging out of foster care. I didn't grow up in foster care, nor did I know people in foster care. So when I lived in New York, I stayed with a young lady who worked for this agency who would try to blindly adopt teenagers. And I said, well, who would possibly adopt a child that you never met? So she said, well, between the ages of, if they're not adopted by 12, a lot of times people just don't want those kids. Like if they're not the cute babies or the young toddlers, oftentimes their chances of being adopted their chances of being adopted is basically really rare. So so then she started talking about, through a lot of kids being in foster care in so many homes and, dealing with so many different issues that they are often disappointed. So to have someone possibly adopt them, they don't want them to, take them and then all of a sudden see some of their flaws and say, oh, I don't want them. So they would provide like whatever issues the kids have, their history, blah, 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 blah. So I was like, wow. And so I knew that I would do something about it. I just didn't know when or where, and didn't have the resources at the time. And then fast forward years later, I decided like, okay, it's time. There was a young man that one of the characters, he wanted something rich. So he sort of motivated me to go ahead and get the journey started. But I made sure, like when I told the cast and crew, I said, listen, this is not just a movie. We're not just trying to make art. I really want this to make a difference because like me, so many people never heard of it. Then I had a young lady, Davita Jones, who I just love and adore, who actually aged out of foster care. And she came to our rehearsal and she shared her journey. you could hear a pin drop, but also not one person in our cast or crew had even thought about or heard of anyone aging out of foster care. And it became even more personal for me. And then one of my friends who is a filmmaker, she came on board and, she was like, what is this? And I told her, and then she shared with me that she aged out. So it's so many people that's walking around that we know, amazingly talented, that you just don't know their backstory. And both of their stories are, like the short film, that young man's journey is like so minimal to some of the experiences of youth who age out of foster care. And so that was pretty much the inspiration. Now, when I shot the short film, Aged Out, at that particular time, across the board, aging out was 18. So there have been discussions, and some states have raised the age limits to 21. What I often tell people when I think about myself at 18 or 21, I thought I had great sense, but I didn't. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I look at my niece, we always think we know everything, but can you imagine like growing up not having parents? Can you imagine growing up unfortunately, in some situations in abusive households? Or I saw a story recently where, one person had been in 30 homes, another person in 17 homes. So no stability, having feelings of abandonment, not trusting because every adult that could have loved you didn't, take the time to work through your issues. And so can you imagine now becoming an adult after having that life, and people expect you to be able to function as a normal adult? And at 18 or 19, 18 to 21, even if you have two parents in your home, you typically don't act like a normal adult. You know what I mean? Like, so I think the expectation for these youth, I think the system is failing many of them. So yeah, that's side of the motivation. And I'll be honest, Three, I get so passionate about this because I just feel like it's such an injustice to humanity that these young people have to endure this type of life in this country that we live in. It's so not fair.
I agree. And when you talk about the fact that some states have raised the age to 21, you think about kids that are with their parents, they're with their families, and how many of them go out on their own by the age of 21? Not too many. I was still living with my parents at 21, and most of my friends were still living with their parents at age 21. So even then, like you said, you're still young and dumb. You still don't know nothing, even though you think you know everything. And you still need a lot of help. Doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. And, and I just want to commend, like this, my journey with this movie has been very difficult. Whenever you're doing something to make a difference or to at least start a conversation, because I honestly don't have the answers on how to make this better. But what I will say is, I feel like if we start the conversation, as I've been sharing the short film as I can, as we've gone to festivals, people will say, oh my God, I never heard of this. I never thought about what happens to youth. And so
Are you there?
Yeah, I just been muting. So as I was coughing, sorry.
Oh, okay. Do you need some water?
Yeah, I'm grabbing some right now. Just a second here.
Okay.
Excuse me. So as I've been going to festivals or sharing it online, I would tell you 99% of the people will say to me, like, oh my God, I never thought about what happens to youth who age out of foster care. I never thought even that they age out of foster care. It's just not a thought. And so I don't have the answers. And I wish I knew more or could figure out, but I do feel like as more people see the short film, at least it can start a conversation. There's also a film by another filmmaker that I'm really, really excited about that should be coming out probably sometime this year or early next year, called Foster Boy. And it comes from a different perspective. It talks about this young man who was, this fight in the system that was placed into a group home where they knew it was a sexual offender in it. And it's starring Louis Gossett Jr. and quite a few other people that you may have seen, but it looks really amazing. So I'm just glad that there's so many more conversations happening about the foster care system in general. And I don't want to paint the foster care system like this ugly thing, because it's not. I think it's you know, last year the Department of Human Services in Newport News hosted a screening for Aged Out, and they had set up panel discussions, and had food, lots of it was really great, and to bring awareness to the community. Well, what was very interesting, which was different from like going to the festivals, oftentimes the um, I hear, the side like, oh, I didn't know. So then you have the people who work in the foster care system, and to read their response to me was amazing. They were like, thank you, because sometimes we get burnt out and we forget why we do this. And so it's also that they're overworked, and they're not able to manage all the cases they have oftentimes. So it's this unfortunate thing, but it is a business. And so at the end of the day, we're failing a lot of children. And if nothing else, there should be a pathway for life skills and programs. And I do think, from my friends that have aged out of foster care, the programs that are available now are much better than they were, 10, 15 years ago, but we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, I like that your film brought awareness. It's a little bit under 30 minutes, and I'm going to have a link in the show notes to the film so that you can watch it. And it's called, again, Aged Out. It's on Vimeo if you can't wait, but I got a link in the show notes. And I also want to mention a few other recent things that I have seen about foster care, even though they're not all exactly about aging out. Just in case you're interested in the foster care system and some more perspectives. I recently read a book by Rachel Hollis. It's called Girl Wash Your Face. I think it came out last year. And she talked about a really harrowing experience that she had with foster care, where she did end up adopting a child, I think at least one child from foster care, but there were a lot of missteps. And then there's another book that I'm reading now called Counterculture by David Platt. He talks about I guess him and his wife were infertile for 5 years. And so they adopted a child. And then right after they adopted their son, she got pregnant, and then they had their child, and then they adopted more children. So excuse me, that's a really interesting story about foster care. And then thirdly, if you don't feel like reading at all, there's actually a series on CBS right now called SWAT with Shamar Moore. And there's a storyline where he has just adopted a 17-year-old boy that was caught up in gangs and stuff like that. Him and his TV mother, Debbie Allen, decided to adopt this boy that was almost aged out. And they talked about what Tomeka just mentioned about the fact that, he's from an undesirable background. He's a Black boy. He's from the streets. He's older. And, there were parents that I think he was going to be adopted by that were interested in him. But it was very clear when the people visited those parents that they were just in it for the money only. So there's various different stories out there, real and, for entertainment purposes, about foster care that I think are helping to bring awareness to this subject. And certainly your film is completely a different perspective. I enjoyed watching it, even though in a way, like, I was tearing up at some parts, because it talks about the story of not just someone aging out, but also of a widow that finds him. And so for me as a widow, that teared me up a little bit, because, I could kind of understand some of the, familial caring going on there. But I also want to now shift gears and talk about another very heavy topic, something that is very close to my heart, which is human trafficking. I know that you co-produced a documentary that's entitled In Plain Sight. And I want you to talk a little bit about that documentary and human trafficking in this country, because there's a lot of myths that people think that either themselves or their kids are not susceptible because of maybe where they live or how old they are or what type of people they are. And So I would really like you to help dispel some of those myths and talk about that a little bit.
Thank you. Again, I don't know, like God always just like Tomeka here, and I'm like, oh gosh, can I have something fun? But I think, but he's like, no, you have a purpose. So I am grateful that he uses me as a vessel. So let me give you a backstory a little bit. So one day I was at my aunt's house in Norfolk, and I came outside, and this young lady was about, I would say she looked like maybe 14 or 15 years old, and her hair was all over her head. And I don't know, I just felt led to be like, stop her. And I said, why aren't you in school? And she said, I have a doctor's appointment. But when she was walking, she was roaming aimlessly. Like it wasn't like I'm walking with purpose. You could tell that she was just a little lost. And so I said to her, I said, so I said, and I don't know why I said, are you hungry? And she said, yes. So I said, okay. And I said, well, let's go to McDonald's. And I took her to McDonald's and I got her some breakfast. And then I asked her where do I need to drop her off. And I went to take her to this house that was maybe a few blocks away from my aunt's house. When I pulled up, it was about 30 grown men in the middle of let me say it was morning. So it was about maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. So I said to her, I said, who are those men? And she was like, oh, they're my cousins and blah, 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 blah. And that your spirit says no. But at that time, I knew nothing about human trafficking. So fast forward, I had this dream, and this dream was very vivid. I mean, it was like, without giving all of the dream, it just went into this journey of this young lady who was a victim of human trafficking that was also amongst a group of young ladies that were victims of human trafficking. The pimp in the dream, they called him Poppy. And so later, the next day I told a friend, I said, listen, I had this dream and I feel like it means something. I don't know if it's a book or a movie, but I feel like it means something. And so she said, well, ironically, one of our clients just came in and she talked about this organization, the Virginia Beach Justice Initiative, that she was volunteering with. And so I said, connect me with her. And so she did. And so long story short, I met with them, went to one of their informational meetings. And, he said, well, I want you to pray. He told everyone, he said, pray about how God wants to use you because it's different ways for different people. And often he wants to use your gifts. So I did. I prayed and I went home that night. And the rest of the dream, the rest of it felt in like a movie, like it played like a movie. So I was like, oh my God, so then I decided to volunteer with the Virginia Beach Justice Initiative. And they took us through this advocacy training. And some of the things that happened in the dream, the explanations were in through the training. Like, for example, Poppy, most pimps have their girls to call them some form of daddy, and branding and so forth and so on. And I honestly, Doree, could not write the movie because it was too painful. And the more I learned, the more my heart ached. And so ironically, I said, well, so one of the ladies who was one of the instructors was a police officer for Newport News. And she said, why don't you do a documentary? And so I said, well, okay. So I said, well, that might be a little bit easier. And so I did. And they had they were very helpful in connecting us. But at the time I was like, how am I going to fund this? And I started looking. In the interim, I met a young lady who was a survivor, a couple ladies who were survivors, but one in particular, her name is Tanya Street. She goes by Tanya Gold now. So we became good friends, and she explained a lot that I didn't understand. And from that, I was on the board of the VPA at the time, Virginia Production Alliance. And at the time, Will Rodriguez, that is the manager at Cox in their video department, they were working on the documentary, but he heard me and another lady talking about, it happening right in our neighborhoods, and it just piqued his interest. So he set up a meeting with one of his producers, and he had me come in, and I already had a treatment. So I took it in, and basically, I sort of handed it over to them because they had the resources. And it was such a wonderful experience, but also educational experience, not just for me, but also for everyone involved. And, we again talk about sex trafficking, and oftentimes we think about taken, or we think about, just the kids who are kidnapped. One of the things that was just so hard that I learned was, oftentimes, let me give you an example. There was this movie we watched, and I forget the name of it, but it was a training movie. The young lady worked in a restaurant, like most, teenagers, like 16 years old. And it was this man who would come in, and if you work in a restaurant, you become familiar with your customers. And she starts, telling him every day, the things that she, wants to do, what her dreams and desires was. Well, basically, what he did was he fed all that information to a very handsome young man, and he had the young man come approach her. So they started dating, and she thinks she just met the guy of her dreams, not knowing that this guy was leading her into a sex trafficking arena. So he, would then say, "Hey, I don't have enough money. Maybe you could strip for me." And then oftentimes what would happen is they would have these girls do inappropriate things for love, because oftentimes we think about them being kidnapped, but there's so many ways. It's sometimes young women who are victims of sex trafficking, and they make them go out and find other girls, and they befriend girls that, they befriend girls, and they'll say, "Hey, da 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 da." Then all of a sudden, this girl thinks she's her bestie, and now she's hanging out with this girl, and before you know it, she's involved in sex trafficking. And I think the biggest eye opener for me to read, that was just so heartbreaking, was oftentimes we think about the kids who are kidnapped, but it's kids that's involved in sex trafficking that come home every night to their family. Like, they will think the kids are at school playing soccer or whatever, and these pimps will say, "No, doing that hour or 2 hours that you're supposed to be doing your extracurricular activity, you're going to be sleeping with this man or that man. And if you don't, we're going to kill your parents. We'll kill your sister. We'll blah, 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 blah." And so the conversations, like what I would encourage your audience, because this is just a short segment, is really research sex trafficking. Pay attention to your children. And oftentimes, like, we'll look at kids and we'll be like, "Oh, they're going through puberty. They're acting this way." And I'm not saying that's always the case, but make sure you don't dismiss like what else could be going on in your child's life, because the children often want to protect their families and their parents. So they will do things, or can be convinced to do things that's very hurtful to them, just to protect them. So, really take the time to research. There's so much information out there. And I know we don't want to have these hard conversations, because it's not pretty, and it's ugly, and it's sometimes very painful to watch or learn about. But it could be your child, your niece, your nephew, your neighbor's child, and see the signs. One of the things, at first I was very sensitive, and so every time I would see an older man with a young one, like a teenage girl, I'd be like, "Is he, is he, is that really her grandfather?" So I was like, going overboard. But one of the things one of the police officers told me, he said, "Hey, listen, it's better to be safe than sorry. If you feel something in your gut that's not right, call us. Because if it's not right and they're innocent, they'll be fine. But if you're wrong, they will be," excuse me, let me go back. "If you're wrong about calling us on someone, and it happens to be, let's say, their grandfather, uncle, godfather, then it could be the case. Then they'll get off on it. But if it's not, you could save someone's life, So take the time to research and learn a little bit more about sex trafficking, because it's happening in every neighborhood, every neighborhood.
Yep. I think you've got to be aware when you're out and you see, certain kinds of body language,
Yes.
they're not going to risk their life to say, "Oh my God, help me, please help me." But, there's certain ways that, people look, whether they're kids or, 25,
Mm-hmm.
and they can be distressed. One of the things that I learned, I interviewed a woman named Dr. Marlene Carson a few years ago on this podcast. And the episode is called There's Always Traffic, if you haven't listened to it. But Dr. Carson is a survivor of sex trafficking, and she now helps survivors of sex trafficking. One of the things that she taught me is that, not only can it happen, anywhere, not only is it boys and girls, not just
Yes,
girls, but pimps can also be male or female.
absolutely.
There's so many things that, she taught me. And they're basic things that we just all think that, oh, we already know that. No, I didn't know that stuff. I think I'm pretty intelligent and I didn't know. So absolutely, you've got to be more aware of people around you. And I think that just in general in this country, Tomeka, we have this tendency to mind our own business. I don't need to worry about
Yeah.
that because it ain't me, it ain't my kid, it ain't my mom, it ain't, we do need to be each other's brothers and sisters keeper. We do need to do that. That is why the world is going downhill so quickly, is because we're turning a blind eye to certain things, where people don't have the power, don't have the confidence, don't have the voice to stand up for themselves. And we need to be that voice. I'm not talking about, someone making a
100%.
conscious decision and saying, I'm living my life the way I want to live it. I'm talking about people that are actually victims, people that are stuck, people that don't have the voice and the means to help themselves. We are obligated to help them. If we're doing better than them, then we are obligated to help lift them up.
And also, Doree, let me tell you what one of the survivors told me. One of the things she said to me, and I thought that was so poignant. Learning about sex trafficking changed my life. It helped me to be so much less judgmental, because we can look at somebody and we can say, well, she chose to do this. I forgot what happened. And I was like, I just can't understand how a man could do this. And she said, Tomeka, she said, how many children, how many little girls grow up saying, I want to be a prostitute? How many young boys grow up saying, I want to be a pimp? And I said, none. And then she says, that's right. She said, oftentimes the pimp is even have been victimized. She said, oftentimes when you see these, so when we look at lifestyle and we even say people who choose it, because let's just say, for instance, you've been sexually abused, the preserving of your body is not going to be the same for somebody who waited until they met somebody they really liked, because somebody took that from you. So your value on sex is going to be different, And so where we could look at somebody and oftentimes somebody, and I hate when someone says, well, she's a hoe or she's a this. Well, have you ever thought about what her experience was? Have you ever thought about why she chooses, to be with so many people? Because maybe she's looking for love. Maybe somebody took that from her. Maybe she was raped. 1 out of 4 women are raped. 1 out of 6 men have been raped, And unfortunately for men, they don't even usually have the vehicles to talk about it, because then they start dealing with their sexuality. But that's a whole nother conversation. So I would just say, I hope that your listeners will, if nothing else, be less judgmental. And sometimes instead of judging, say why. What could be that person's backstory? Because we all have a backstory.
Yeah, absolutely. Be less judgmental and more compassionate.
Yes.
There you have it. Tomeka, we have gone deep for quite a while. I know some people are probably feeling real sad right now. And I'm sorry if you are, even though these are important things we need to think about. But now I'm going to bring us back into smiling territory. And I'm going to ask you a couple more questions that are more so about you and, what you do now. Like I said before, your journey, and it's very inspirational. How do you define success?
That's a great question, Doree. For me, I feel like someone looking outside in could say, Tomeka, have you really reached success? Because no one knows your name. Your movies aren't on the big screen. And I would say I have. I love what I do. I wake up every morning, even when there's no dime on the table, and I work diligently every day, whether it's writing, working on my podcast, whether it's, planning for a project that may or may not get seen by many people. I absolutely love it. I'm actually in the process. I'm going to take that leap of faith, and I'm moving to LA later this year. So fingers crossed. And I am so at peace right now, and I'm probably in the best state that I have ever been in emotionally, mentally, not necessarily physically. I need to work on that, but I am such in a great place. So I do feel like I have reached success, and I think success is so, it's an individual measure, like what success is to me may be different for you to read and to the next person, so I think what makes you happy. Of course, we want to be able to have that, balance. But yeah, I think it depends on the person.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. We often talk about self-care, and I have actually seen Tamika a few times in the past few weeks, but before that, I hadn't seen her in a really like years and years. So it's
Yeah.
really crazy. I participated in one day of a production that Tamika was on, and she said that she had a lot of fun doing it, but she was only getting a few hours of sleep every night, like 3 hours of sleep. And I'm like, that's not really good self-care, Tamika. But she said that. But you said you love it. So, to you, it wasn't a big deal.
No, I mean, like, I can honestly say, like, this production was a diversity and training video that I was hired as a freelancer to produce. It was so much fun. It was so much fun. We worked really hard, and that team works really hard. But we worked hard, but we also laughed so much, but everything got done, and it was just like probably one of the most exciting companies I've worked for, because they just have this youthful, playful spirit about them, and it reminds me of being young again.
Oh yeah, everybody was really cool and easygoing. I didn't know anyone except Tamika on the set, but everybody was really easy to work with, especially someone like me that is definitely not a regular person on sets. My last question for you, Tamika, this one is my favorite question. What would you tell your younger self? What advice would you give your younger self, whether it's a personal or professional advice?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I wasn't prepared for that, Doree.
I know.
I would tell my younger self, give myself permission to fail. Oftentimes I have been so stressed out because I didn't reach a goal, or the outcome wasn't what I expected. And I beat myself up horribly because of that, often would get depressed. And, one of the other things I would tell myself is, my younger self, is to make me a priority. Oftentimes, especially as women, we make everyone else in our lives a priority. So when I became a woman of a certain age, I decided that I don't care. I'm going to make a decision based upon whether it works for me. So I have no problem saying no now. I
Hmm.
have no problem, doing something that someone else thinks is crazy. And I don't look for any validation from other people. And when it comes to, like I said, forgiving myself, or, allow myself to fail, I feel like the greatest lessons that I have learned has been in those moments that I deemed failure, but actually has propelled me to move forward on my personal and professional journeys.
Awesome. Amazing. That is the soundbite right there. Thank you so much, Tamika, for being on the show and for kicking it with me. It was really cool because even though I know you and have known you for quite a while, there's still things that I learned, and I'm sure our listeners have learned. How can people reach you if they want to work with you or see your work?
Well, I would say first go to TomekaWinborne.com, and that's TOMEKAWIN, B as in boy, ORNE.com. And I'm sure Doree will have it in the show notes. And I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, all under Tomeka Winborne. Easy to find. So yeah, and I do respond to messages. If it's a busy week, it may take me a little bit longer than usual, but I never not respond. So please reach out to me, and definitely, and you can also I have aged out on the website. So please take a look and share it with your friends. Not just to be like, oh, watch my movie, but also just we can really enact change by starting these conversations where I or you independently may not know the answers, but collectively we can figure it out.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Doree. First of all, it has been so much fun kicking it with Doree today. And I am so excited about the work that you're doing. And thank you for having such wonderful guests, the work that you're doing, because you're also, I feel like, enacting change. You're bringing awareness to a lot of issues. So thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Yeah. I appreciate it.
We out.
That was fun. We out.
Thank you for kicking it with me today on the Kicking It with Doree podcast.